Dear Lord Jesus, we know that, your word is a continual source of nourishment. So we just pray over Naomi today that, you will speak through her and that she will feel refreshed to deliver this word to us, Lord Jesus. Bless her. In your name, amen.
Amen. Thanks. Ooh, there we go. Thanks, Kirsty. Okay. So we're in this series on about discipleship, or might call it apprenticeship, that we're calling Dust. And Rupert has been introducing to us this model, if we could have the model up on the screen, it'll come up in a minute, about spiritual formation. And this idea that we are being shaped by something, and we will either be shaped unintentionally or we can be shaped intentionally. And our goal as Christians is we want to be people who are intentionally shaped by the character, by the teaching, and by the mission of Jesus. And this morning we're going to be looking at this bottom corner that I've circled about the difference between relationships and community. That in our unintentional spiritual formation, we will be shaped in part by the people that are around us, the people that we hang out with. But as Christians, we are called to community, and they're different things. So relationships we tend to form with people that are like us, that are similar to us in some way, or similar to us in lots of ways. Whereas community is where we gather with people who may be very different from us. They might be different ages, they might be different life stages, they might be have different backgrounds or different coloured skin, they might vote differently from us, they might have children or not have children, or work or not work, or all kinds of different ways that we might be different from one another. But this just doesn't just happen. So I was reading a study earlier in the week that they did in American campuses, American universities. And they looked at small, rural university campuses, and they did various questions about personality and about background and all these different things. And then they looked at people's networks, people's social connections. And they found, perhaps unsurprisingly, that most people were connected with people who were very similar to them, who were very like them. And then they did exactly the same study in a much bigger kind of inner city campus, much, much more diverse. People travel from all over the world. People come from different backgrounds. I mean, still university students, but a much more diverse setting. And they found that people's friendships were even more similar than they had been in the small university. So just having access to, just brushing shoulders with people that are different does not mean that we will form deep and meaningful relationships with them. So let's look together at the kind of people that Jesus gathered around himself. If you've got Bibles with you, turn with me to Matthew chapter 10. We're going to look at two passages in Matthew today. But Matthew chapter 10, verses 2 to 4. And again, it will come up on the screen as well. Great, thanks, Luke. These are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, also known as Peter, and his brother Andrew. James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanian, and Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed him. Now, perhaps surprisingly, we actually don't have a huge amount of detail about Jesus' disciples. It's mostly their names, a few bits of relational information, who was brothers with who their fathers were, some of them. But there are two disciples, or two apostles, that we do have information about. And they are Matthew, and we learn that Matthew was a tax collector. Now, in those days, tax collectors were incredibly unpopular. They would collaborate with the occupying Roman army to collect people's taxes, and they would cream their own little bit off the top. So they were generally very wealthy. Then we have Simon, and Simon is described as a zealot. Now, the Zealots were a political group who believed that people should resist the Roman occupation with whatever means necessary. In fact, often they would incite violent rebellion, and some of them were known as dagger men. They would conceal knives in their cloaks and go to crowded places, and then they would sneak up behind a Roman centurion, cut his throat, and then disappear off into the crowd. And they hated, I cannot overstate this, they hated anybody that colluded with the Romans in any way, shape, or form. So you've got a tax collector and you've got a zealot that are both part of Jesus' close circle. Anyone see the potential for maybe a bit of tension, bit of awkwardness? And then, as I say, Matthew probably was very rich. whereas fishermen would have lived a much more hand-to-mouth existence. There would have been kind of wealth discrepancies in there as well. We know that Peter was married, his mother-in-law's mentioned it once, we don't know about the others, but we certainly see differences in personality between them as we read the Gospels. Yes, they were all Jewish, yes, they were all male, but this was not a homogeneous bunch of people. Let's skip forward a few chapters to the beginning of Matthew chapter 18. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" I'm just going to pause there. This story that we're about to read, it's reported in Matthew. We also read it in Mark and in Luke, the same story. And in Mark and Luke's account, it says the disciples were arguing. They were having a fight about who was the greatest. Matthew's maybe being a little bit coy here, a bit diplomatic, kind of implies they just went up and said, "Jesus, we're just curious. Who's the best? We're just wondering." No, they were having a proper argument with one another. And you can imagine it, can't you? Maybe Peter went first and he says, "Hey, look, Jesus said I'm the rock. He said he was going to build his church on me. And anyway, I was the first to say that he was the Messiah. Surely I'm the best." You were the first. I told you right from the beginning he was the Messiah. You wouldn't even be here if it wasn't for me. You're so quiet. We hardly notice you're here half the time. What kind of leader do you think you'll make? No, guys, I don't know if anyone's noticed, but Jesus is in some serious hot water here. What we need is somebody that can offer a bit of protection. I can speak to some people, make sure that he doesn't get hurt. I'm sorry, were you even listening with the Sermon on the Mount? He said, love your enemies, not slit their throats. I have been working with the Romans for years. I've got diplomacy skills. I've got influence. You can see how it might have played out, can't you? But what does Jesus do? Jesus called a child who he put among them and said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever becomes humble like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me." So they're all busy competing. They're all busy fighting with one another. Who's the best? Who's the greatest? Who's going to be in charge? And Jesus sweeps up a child and says, "Here you go. Here's your discipleship model." Things we've been talking about discipleship, talking about maturity, I guess. That's what we think of in terms of discipleship. How can we grow up in the faith? How can we become mature? Are we supposed to be mature or are we supposed to be childlike? Which is it? There's an American pastor and writer called Mandy Smith who I found really helpful in looking at this passage. She says often when we read this passage, we make a contrast between being childlike and being childish. And we all know what being childish is. Some say, "Oh, don't be so childish." Maybe kind of throwing a sort of temper tantrum, or they're demanding to get their own way, or they won't take responsibility for something. We say, "Oh, they're being so childish." We're not called to be childish. We're called to be childlike. But she also says, and she invents a word here, which I think is brilliant, really helpful. She also says we are called to be mature. We're called to be adult-like in lots of ways. We are not called to be adultish. And she defines adultish like this. When we're adultish, we become overly responsible and obsessed with making everything come out right. We feel we need to be in control at all times. I've been really struck as we've gone through this particular question of the week, how many people have said just this season has taught them they can't be in control all the time. There's so much that we can't control, no matter how hard we try and how much we would like to. So yes, we are called to be mature. We're called to grow up without becoming adultish. And I would suggest that when it comes to being overly responsible, when it becomes to being obsessed with being in control and making things right, one of the things that shows that up the most is being around people who are different from us. Because if you and I disagree, I want to make you right. I want to fix you. I want to make sure you think the right thing. Because Of course I'm right. I do this. I will own this, okay? I do this. Or, if somebody is feeling an emotion or they're expressing something that I don't think they should be feeling right now, well, I want to fix it. What can I do? How can I change it? How can I make it all right again? Or if somebody is different in a way that isn't changeable, that isn't fixable, we want to make sure that, well, at least we are the ones in control. We're the ones that make the decisions, because I've set up my world the way I like it, thank you very much. I don't want you coming and messing all that up. Or maybe we just keep our distance. You do your thing over here, I'll do my thing over here, and we don't need to disturb each other too much. My mum likes to tell this story of when I was probably about 7. I've always loved to read, and I also used to love listening to audiobooks. I used to have a little cassette Walkman player. Yes, I am that old, cassette Walkman player. And I used to listen to audiobooks, and one day we were on holiday, and she, I think, was in the kitchen making dinner or something. She was busy. And I walk in, and I go, Mummy, what's a hooker? And she's busy, she's in the middle of making dinner, but she also believes in giving straight answers to children who ask direct questions. So she takes a deep breath, and she gives her best age-appropriate explanation of what she euphemistically calls ladies of the night. And partway through, she turns around, and I am looking totally baffled. I go, but Mummy, that doesn't make any sense. Because in Alice in Wonderland, it says the caterpillar was sat on a mushroom smoking a hookah. If you don't know what a hookah is in that context, it's a type of pipe. Children ask a lot of questions, right? If you're around children for any length of time, they ask loads and loads of questions. One study I read said that preschool children ask between 300 and 400 questions a day. Some studies put it a bit lower, but it's a lot, okay? It's a lot of questions. Adults, on average, what do you reckon? How many questions do you reckon adults ask in the average day? Anyone want to kind of take a guess? What do you think? 30? Anyone else? 10? Higher, lower? 2? 6. 6. On average, adults ask 6 questions a day. Now, if you're a teacher or a doctor or whatever, you're probably bringing the average up a bit, but in our day-to-day lives, adults tend not to ask many questions. We tend to think we know the answers. We tend to make assumptions. We tend to think we know what other people think, what other people feel, what other people's experiences are. Now, to give my mum her due, usually she would have checked something like, where did you hear that word? Or, where did that come from? But in that moment, she made an assumption. She thought she knew what I was asking. She thought I knew the backstory. She thought she knew my backstory. But she didn't. And then when we come to Jesus, we see Jesus asking questions all over the place. All kinds of different questions. Rupert mentioned one of these questions a few weeks back. Jesus encounters this blind man. And he says, what do you want me to do for you? Isn't it obvious, Jesus? I mean, the guy's blind. It's a problem. Fix it. And I feel like Jesus is saying, well, he's not just a blind man. He's a person. Maybe he's got a daughter at home that he's worried about. Maybe his back's killing him from sitting on the floor all day. Maybe I don't know what he wants. What do you want me to do for you? Or when he comes to his disciples and he says, who do people say that I am? I mean, they could have said anything. Actually, Jesus, most people think you've lost it. They think you're some kind of lunatic. Actually, Jesus, people are saying you are the most boring teacher they have ever heard. But they could have said anything, and Jesus doesn't really seem to mind. He seems to be open to whatever they have to say to him. Or even more vulnerably, when he causes some controversy and a whole load of people leave, he turns to the 12 and says, are you going to go too? Do you want to leave as well? And I think they could have said yes and walked away. And I don't think Jesus would have chased after them. Because genuine curiosity is really vulnerable. Because we don't know what the other person is going to say. We're opening ourselves up to their influence on our lives, on our hearts, on our experience, on our way of thinking. Now, there is a false curiosity that is like, well, don't you think we should just do this? Isn't it obvious that blah, 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 blah? I can't remember who said this. Someone described that as advice with a question mark on the end. Okay, that's not curiosity. But children are curious. Now, I have no idea if this ever happened. We don't have this recorded in the Gospels. But what if Matthew the tax collector sat down with Simon the zealot and asked him what he really wanted? Simon, what's important to you? What moves your heart? What do you really want out of life? What are you looking for? Or if Simon asked Matthew, how did you end up a tax collector anyway? What's your story? How did you end up here? Did anyone ever ask Andrew what it was like growing up in Peter's shadow? Or ask Thomas what he imagined, what he was so afraid of when he held himself back all the time? I think if they followed Jesus' example and were curious about one another, that might have changed how they thought about each other. Maybe they wouldn't have fought quite so much. Now, at the beginning of this passage that we've just read, there's this phrase, at that time. At what time? At that time. At the same time as the thing that's just happened in the previous chapter. And the thing that's just happened in the previous chapter, that we'll read in a minute, is, I'm going to level with you, one of the slightly weirder gospel stories. Read it with me. So, chapter 17, beginning at verse 24. This is the lead-in to the story that we've just read, okay? When they, that's the disciples, reached Capernaum, the collectors of the temple tax came to Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the temple tax?" And he said, "Yes, he does." And when he came home, Jesus spoke of it first, asking, "What do you think, Simon? From whom do kings of the earth take toll or tribute? From their children or from others?" When Peter said, "From others," Jesus said to him, "Then the children are free. However, so that we do not cause offense to them, go to the sea and cast a hook. Take the first fish that comes up, and when you open its mouth, you'll find a coin. Take that and give it to them for you and for me." Now, with Mandy Smith's definition of adultishness, I think we can say that Peter is being a bit adultish at the beginning of this story. He's either made an assumption, yes, Jesus does pay the temple tax, which, as you read on, clearly isn't true. Jesus hasn't paid the temple tax. Or he knows that Jesus hasn't paid the temple tax, and he's like, this is a problem. We need to fix it. I'll sort it out. Come on, let's go and speak to Jesus and make sure that this happens, because this is going to be a disaster, and it's going to be a whole big thing, and Jesus, you better have some money to pay the temple tax. And Jesus' response is to tell a story. He gets Peter into his imagination. So let's imagine there's a king. Who does he take his tax from? And in this story, Peter is cast as a child. So is Jesus. But he says, are you a child of the king? Or are you a child of someone else? Because they're the ones that have to pay this temple tax. And then he comes up with this idea to go fishing and find a coin in a fish's mouth. Now, I've got a 3.5-year-old at home, and sometimes when she comes home from nursery, we'll say, "What did you do at nursery today?" And she'll say, "I don't know," or "nothing," or something. And so I'll say something like, "Did you feed an elephant?" She'll go, "No, Mummy, don't be silly." She'll say, "Did you tickle a dinosaur?" "No, Mummy, don't be silly, I didn't tickle a dinosaur." "Did you go to the moon?" "No, we didn't go to the moon." And then she starts laughing and she'll say, oh, no, we did some painting, or we played football, or whatever we did. But she loves those ridiculously silly suggestions. They bring her out of herself. And I think going to find some tax money in the mouth of a fish sounds like something a 4-year-old would love. Isn't it? It's playful. It's funny. It's kind of ridiculous. And Jesus says, go on, Peter. That's where you get your tax if you're so worried about it. And Peter's got a choice. He can stay in his adultish mindset. Okay, Jesus, exactly where in the sea do I need to go? Because the sea's quite big. I need to make sure I'm in the right place. And what kind of fish is it? I need to make sure I've got the right bait and the right line. And what if I don't find it? How long is it going to take? Am I going to have to go fishing for a long time or a short time? Or he can just play. Or he can just join in. I love this quote that talks about what playfulness is. It's from an article that I'll link in the email that gets sent out later in the week. It says, playfulness begins with a first simple yes. When a smile is offered, do you smile in return? When music plays, will you dance? When the ball is thrown, do you hold out your hand to catch it? It lives with open hands, not worried about controlling each little detail, but instead available for spontaneity and discovery. What if part of our call as good news people, and I don't think this happens overnight, but is to gradually become people who are not only curious about people who are different from us, not only willing to open ourselves up and ask questions, but can even play with people that don't share our story. People that look different from us, sound different from us, have different experiences, have different resources. Because you know what? It's not possible. It is not biologically possible to genuinely play with somebody and to feel threatened by them at the same time. Your body can't do it. Either you're not really playing or you don't feel threatened. It's not possible to be joyfully connected in play to somebody and want to control them or harm them or anything like that. You can't do it. Now, I want to give 2 really important caveats here. The first is that I'm talking about difference, and I am not really talking about power at the minute. But in a broken world, some differences inherent in them have a power dynamic. There's a power differential. And that could be a whole sermon series of itself, but I wanted to at least name it, because often we don't notice it, particularly if we are the ones that have the power and the other is the one that doesn't. We tend not to see it. But I don't think it's loving to ask someone to come and play on an unfair playing field. And so if we are able to see that we are in a position of power, we may need to change things to make that space safe for somebody else who doesn't have power. And that is on us. The second thing I want to say is that if we have any kind of relational trauma in our background, play of any kind might feel quite threatening and dangerous, and we may need some good counseling and therapy to get us to that place where we can engage with people in that way. So I wanted to just name those 2 things. But in general, what we see here is Jesus interrupting our arguments, our competition, our anxiety, our desire to be right, our desire to be in control, with stories and children playing and imagination. So in a minute, I want to come back and say a few more things about Peter. But before we do, we're going to have a chance again to hear from one another. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give us maybe a minute, 2 minutes of silence just to sit and think about what we've heard, about this story, about what's stirring within you. And there'll be 2 questions that come up on the screen behind me. The first is, what is unsettling or uncomfortable for you about this passage? And the second is, what has resonated or become clearer to you as you've listened? So I'll have a couple of minutes of silence, and then I'll invite people up to the microphone to hear from one another. I'll switch to this microphone. Thanks, Dominic. So we've now got some time to hear from one another what God's Spirit might be sparking amongst us. If you're coming to share, please keep it relatively short, to about a minute, and so we can hear from a number of people. It is okay to hear something that you disagree with, but this is a chance to hear from us, one another in community, as well as through one person on the stage. Yeah, come.
Hi. So I really liked what you were saying, Naomi. So I'm a teacher and I work in a Christian school, which is brilliant, and there's places available. So I do devotion with the kids most days that I work there. And they're always putting their hands up and asking questions. And if I answered every question, we wouldn't get anything taught or anything done. So I'm always saying, put your hand down, put your hand down. But I really love it. There's a little devotion book and I read it out and then I get the kids to imagine it. And God speaks so clearly to kids. It's amazing what they come out with. And I get them to close their eyes and imagine what I've just read out and then share with each other. And they've got these absolutely beautiful pictures that are sort of from their imagination, but at the same time, it's sort of from God as well. And I think sometimes it's easy to dismiss what kids have to say, like especially really young kids. But I think giving them the space, asking them really good questions and giving them the space to answer, we can actually learn a lot about God and how he speaks through children. So,
thank you.
Thanks.
What a great example about how kids hear from God so clearly and what we can learn from them. Great. Yeah, Flick.
Just a couple of thoughts. One is, we've obviously just come out of a time of people being quite isolated and not at all sociable. So actually moving out of our own comfort zone socially is going to feel like maybe a little bit more effort than we might have been used to previously, and might feel a bit sort of anxiety-ridden as well. So just want to recognise that and name it. And also suggest that sometimes a really good place to start is to play with God. There was a really fun game of I Spy I once played with God on a beach on the West Coast when I was on my own. I'd highly recommend picking a game or asking God what he wants to play. And even if it doesn't have to be on your own. If you've got kids and you've got a spare half an hour and you're not sure what to do, why don't you ask God how you want to play? Just a tip with I Spy, God has to pick the letter, otherwise it doesn't really work. But I'd highly recommend it.
I know Flick quite well, and she has so many fantastic stories of being playful with God, so I'm sure she would happily share those if you want to hear more. Colin?
I was just provoked by what was being shared this morning. Something clicked for me. I was, for good or ill, I follow The Apprentice, the BBC programme. And I think I follow it really because it's so ridiculous and so funny and so awful, the way that they end up fighting. But actually that came to me. It came to me that how can they actually produce something good when sewn into that programme, sewn into the whole thing, is enmity. They are pitted against one another, they're competitive, and actually the self-promotion is awful. And it's no wonder that they end up with rubbish, because mostly what they produce is really awful, because they're not working together. And so something that just provoked me, when you hear about Simon the Zealot and Matthew the tax collector sitting down and listening to one another, it's so different. And I think it's really ironic, highly ironic, that programme's called The Apprentice. Because I think part of apprenticeship, as we know with Jesus, is listening and learning and walking together in love and care. So thanks for provoking me. I don't know whether I'll watch the next series, actually, as a result of that. It's quite funny, but I'm just glad that as followers of Jesus, if we lay down that enmity, we lay down our competitives, we can't follow Jesus in community if we're competing with one another.
I love that, Colin. Thank you so much. And I think what you're bringing out is that actually there's great creativity when we can sit down with people that are different and play together and be curious. There's the chance to create something beautiful. And if we're fighting with each other, what we produce is rubbish.
That's right. And there's some comments on Zoom. So Stephanus says, both uncomfortable and has resonated. The story of the church has been largely adultish. And then Abby has said, love how Jesus brings us back to simplicity, love and being a child of our Heavenly Father, uncomplicating our often complicated adult life and bringing equality that we are all his children, precious and loved. Chris has then said, love the encouragement to question and explore what is really in the heart of another. And then our biggest child of all, Justin, says, paying tax is bad and fishing is good, ? He's asked a question, you see.
Okay, good on you, Justin, for being curious. Thank you for that. Speaking of fishing, the first time that Peter meets Jesus elsewhere in the Gospels, Jesus does another fishing miracle. And Peter's response is to say, get away from me, I'm sinful. And I think that tells us something about how Peter sees himself and maybe how he sees God. Because as I've mentioned, in this temple tax story, there's two sets of children. Now, I don't fish, I've never been fishing, but I'm told it's good thinking time. Fishing doesn't happen quickly. So Jesus tells a story, invites Peter to be curious and playful, and then sends him fishing. What do you think he was thinking about when he was fishing? I mean, he could have stayed in his adultish state or, beat himself up and saying, oh, God, put my foot in it again. I'm such a terrible disciple. I always get it wrong. I always say the wrong thing. Jesus is going to be so mad at me that I came and asked him about the temple tax, blah, 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 blah. Or he could have been curious about himself. Do I see myself as a child of the King? Somehow that feels quite uncomfortable. Like, why can I not resonate with that? Where's that from? Is it about the money? I don't know. Where have I learned that I'm not welcome or I'm not invited or I'm not included? What do I want from God anyway? What does he want from me? Have I related out of this kind of dutiful having to give God something? Is there a different kind of relationship that I could have? What might that be like? How would that feel? I think there's this thing that happens as we become curious about one another, we can also become more curious about ourselves. And these two things, they go together and they flow out of each other. And that is a big part, I would suggest, of how we change and grow. Because as we gather in community with people that are different from us, I have the opportunity to reflect on how I respond to you, what you bring up in me. Oh, why do I feel so frustrated with Flick all of the time? She's my friend, I can say that. But that kind of thing, why am I responding in this way to this person that's different? Or maybe you'll ask me a great curious question, I'll go, I'd never thought about it like that before. I'm gonna have to go fishing and mull that one over. And if I only hang out with people like me, I don't get that opportunity in quite the same way. This is the last thing I want to say. At the Last Supper, Jesus said this, as John 13. This is how everyone will know that you're my disciples, if you love one another. He says this to a table of people that includes Matthew the tax collector and Simon the zealot. This is how people will know. When a tax collector and a zealot sit down round the same table, when a tax collector and a zealot are curious about one another, when a tax collector and a zealot are willing to share one another vulnerably their stories, when they're willing to play and have fun and be spontaneous together, that is how the world will know that we are Jesus' people. That kind of community, I think, is inherently missional. In a minute, we're going to come back to a time of worship. If Paul and the band could come and get themselves ready to do that. And you may already have something that God has been provoking in you or speaking to you about. If that's the case, then absolutely stay with that and speak to Jesus about that in this time. An alternative suggestion, if you would like, is to take this story that Jesus tells about the king and his children and imagine yourself with Jesus and him telling you that story. So in your mind's eye, imagine Jesus maybe sitting next to you or standing in front of you and hear him say, Naomi, not Naomi, your name, Naomi, what do you think? Once upon a time there was a king. and he has some children. Who does he take his tax from? His own children or outsiders? And just notice what that brings up in you.